On my birthday, they gave me a cake that said goodbye soon. I gave them a letter from my lawyer and left with the $26.00. They thought I'd already forgotten about. I felt the chill in Daphne's voice the moment she spoke. "Blow out the candles and go back to bed, you old hag whose bladder needs a reminder." She likely meant it as a joke, but there was no laughter in her eyes. She held a microphone as though she were declaring my obituary, disguised as a birthday celebration. I exhaled toward the flickering candles, my breath trembling with contained fury, and watched as someone lifted the cake from its box and placed it on the table. I gathered every ounce of composure when the cake was revealed. Icy red icing spelled out, "Goodbye soon," across its surface. No one sang, no one smiled. The only light came from the candles themselves, flickering in awkward defiance of the cruelty displayed in front of them. My grandson raised his phone and snapped a photo. He thought it was hilarious. He broadcast it live with the caption, "Old Hag Birthday Party, LOL." I carried myself to the kitchen table and sat down, the mug of chamomile in front of me releasing faint steam that curled toward the ceiling like wisps of my dignity, slowly evaporating. Inside, every emotion screamed, heart pounding like a trapped bird's wing slot, but outwardly, I sipped the tea quietly, letting its warmth reach my tongue, encouraging me to remain calm. The laughter echoed through the kitchen, each chuckle branded the walls with resentment. I glanced up briefly at Daphne. She tilted her head and sneered as though interrogating me. "You okay, Grandma?" But she did not wait for answer. Nobody offered a birthday wish. It was as though my birth date became an obituary. I thought back to 6 months ago. There was a division in the living room. Evan and his financial advisor standing before me as I sorted laundry. "Sell the house, Mom," Evan said. "I can promise a win in 6 months." I paused my folding a knit sweater into muted squares and looked at him. "These walls hold our memories," I said. "I cannot let go of that. They called me a relic standing in the way of financial progress," Evan spat. They did not realize that under California Penal Code SS 368, elder financial abuse, like coercing the elderly to sign away assets, carries felony charges of up to 4 years in prison and hefty fines. Suddenly, their simple document signing sounded much darker to me. Daphne chimed in with laughs and sarcastic sympathy. I had made the right choice, I knew that, but they had branded me backward, obsolete. That word relic embedded itself into my mind like shattered glass, shard after shard sinking into my resolve. Years of those small but calculated slights built up, calling me clumsy when I dropped dishes after cooking, ignoring my midnight cups of tea, ridiculing the way I dried tears in bedrooms at sunrise, dismissing every gentle rearrangement I made to keep order in chaos they themselves created. I was the constant. I failed to disappear. I was not supposed to survive long enough to matter. I put the tea down and stood, slowly. My ribs ached from half a century of being squeezed into oblivion, but I felt more upright than I had in years. I glanced one last time at that cake, not with longing or nostalgia, but with dispassionate focus. The icing bore no sweetness for me anymore. The joke was thin, hollow. I straightened my shoulders as though I were harnessing a weapon of peace. I did not walk quickly. I walked with intention. They heard my heel on the tile floor, and the laughter died out behind me. I did not even glance back. I would not feed rage. Rather, I let the silence behind me collect their mockery like debris. And in that silence, oh how I savored it, I silently planted the seeds of reckoning. Their attempt to mock my death had instead engraved their downfall. The birthday, meant to mark my end, had crystallized the beginning of their reckoning, and I would see that reckoning myself. I walked through the hallway, running my finger along the wall, tracing the faint ridges of the wallpaper that had watched me pour tea and mend hearts, that had borne witness to my life before they chose to belittle it. I opened the front door and inhaled. The air smelled of autumn and promise, something new stirring in the distance. I closed the door behind me gently, footsteps steady, calm worn as armor. They expected collapse. They did not know I was merely composing the first line of my silence-soaked symphony of justice. I had reclaimed the necklace Daphne had angrily tossed in the trash during supper. The one with a simple silver locket and a tiny compartment inside that no one thought to look at. At night, I opened it and found the little audio recorder I had once worn decades ago, the one my husband gave me for gossip emergencies, he had joked. I dusted away the memory of him, then slipped the recorder into the locket, securing it against my chest. That morning, I would wear it under my collar, quiet and unassuming, a weapon planted in plain sight. I heard them whispering in the living room before they came to my bedroom. Daphne said to her brother Evan, her voice low and calm, "We only need one signature on these documents, Helens. Once she signs over her assets, we can put her in the sunroom care wing by Monday." Her tone was clinical, even bored. Evan nodded and said, "Think of it as decluttering. She's old, she's obsolete, might as well do it respectfully." I sat at the kitchen table later and waited for my pill. They tidied my medicines into a small white cup, always the same 2 pills I already took at breakfast, placebo doses they'd substituted to make me drowsy. I held the cup in my hand, lifted it to my lips, let the water flow in, but when I felt the pills on my tongue, I spat them into my napkin and dropped it into the trash, not because I thought I was in danger of overdosing, but because I trusted my body more than theirs. I would live to witness their downfall. Later that night, I settled by my bedside lamp, the house silent except for the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I opened the recorder on my lap and pressed play. Daphne's voice, crisp and distant. "If she just nods and signs, we can move her next week. No fuss, no questions." Then Evan, "We'll arrange it so that no doctors call it violence, just natural decline after a bout." Another voice chimed in, my own voice, years ago, saying, "This'll be mine still," but the others didn't know the recorder listened and remembered every word. I hit stop and held my breath. I pressed play again and again, listening to their plan like they were sketching a murder in broad daylight. Yet here I was, alive, stiff-brack, armed with proof they had no idea I possessed. I closed my eyes and let the realization settle. I was not broken, I was not defeated, and I would not be erased. Their plan to make me vanish had given me what I needed most: absolute clarity. I lifted the recorder, placed it gently back into the locket, and felt the familiar weight against my heart. In silence, I gave thanks for the years of pain that taught me patience, for the disrespect that taught me vigilance, for the lies that made me believe in truth. I slipped the locket back on, turned off the lamp, and lay down wide awake. The house was quiet. The recorder still captured their wickedness in that tiny silver shell, and I drifted off, knowing that one day I would speak through it and be heard. When my bones betrayed me with osteoporosis, I began to frail and ache in ways I could no longer ignore. One night, I sat at my kitchen counter with trembling hands, staring at the bowl of food scraps beside me, and wondered if waste could be transformed into something better, something alive, something that might help, not just me but others. I scavenged every scrap of research I could find on microbial fermentation and anaerobic digestion, then began experimenting in my spare room, repurposing my old crockpot and kitchen scraps into a rudimentary bioreactor. By trial and error, I identified a strain of fibrolytic bacteria that could break down cellulose from vegetable peels, converting them into a rich protein paste we all knew as tempeh, but she could produce it faster and with far higher nutrient retention. I named it Nutribiome, and it became my secret laboratory miracle. I did not tell anyone. I mixed the fermented paste into soup for a neighbor whose diabetes had made her weak and brittle. She recovered enough to walk again, and that doctor said her improvement was medically unexpected. Once, when a community center ran short on protein for a luncheon, I left a container by the door, labeled "Homemade for Sharing." They called it gross and experimental, and one young woman texted, "Elderly lady making lab goo like a Marvel villain." I laughed that day, but deep down I felt a spark. They thought I was a clown for it. Daphne mocked me at brunch. "Still doing your creepy science, Grandma? You and your old jars of bacteria?" Evan pretended concern when I refused to wear the fancy orthopedic shoes they bought me, saying, "You are stuck in a time capsule, Mother." I let them talk. They did not deserve the truth. At night, after I returned from the grocery store, I slipped into my spare room and inspected my next batch. The liquid fermented into thick golden sludge, and I measured protein content with a small handheld meter that beeped affirmingly. Each day I refined it until Nutribiome could stand alone as a fortified meal for an older adult without any supplements. I stored dozens of jars in my pantry, fermenting silently behind canned beans and expired tea bags, as witness to the stubborn genius of someone they called outdated. Once I delivered a jar to my neighbor with bronchitis, and she recovered faster than the nurses expected. When the community center noticed that 3 of their clients stopped losing weight, they offered me a carton of milk in thanks. I accepted it and smiled, then threw the carton away discreetly, because acceptance from them would have meant nothing. They did not understand what real health looked like. They only measured speed and flash and social approval. And so I kept Nutribiome to myself, preserving it like time capsules of what I had built while they criticized me. I did it quietly, because they thought I had become obsolete. They believed the smart world belonged to tech bros and influencers who knew how to pout selfies, not to an old woman fermenting food waste into life. But all the while, I imagined the horror on their faces when they realized the truth. That the person they dismissed as an old science project was the very one who had discovered a nutritional breakthrough that could sustain the elderly, the impoverished, the overlooked. They did not know yet, but one day they would. When I sit now in the dark with a jar of Nutribiome in hand, its odor earthy and wholesome, I taste on my tongue the sweetness of vindication. This is not a paste from garbage. This is nourishment, resilience, proof that even discarded waste can become salvation if you understand fermentation, transformation, and the quiet persistence to persevere. And one day soon, when I reveal it, they will learn what real value looks like. Let them laugh now, they will cry later. The next morning I placed the letter on the dining table in plain view, an envelope thick and formal, bearing the name of my lawyer, enclosed with a single, chilling instruction, handwritten at the flap: to be opened when you think I'm dead. I turned, buttoned my cardigan, took a deep breath, and walked out the front door as though I were going for a simple errand. Just before I closed the door behind me, I walked to the end of the hallway and picked up the local newspaper left folded on a chair. I turned it over my shoulder so that the front page, an article about a new generation of synthetic proteins, lay open, a quiet foreshadowing of the harvest I had planted from scraps. Holding the door handle behind me, I felt Daphne's eyes on me, narrowed with confusion and malice. She called out, "Grandma doesn't want to come in for breakfast? She's lost it, baby. Now she's losing her mind." Her voice cut through the morning like a rusty blade. I did not answer. As I walked down the driveway, I typed a short message into my phone for my grandson Vincent. I remember everything. Just that. No emojis, no weakness. He read it a moment later and replied with 2 tears of joy emojis, but I did not look at my phone again until I was halfway down the street, where the mailman lurked on his route. Daphne shrieked behind me so that the windows rattled. "She's completely gone, losing millions on fairy bacteria nonsense." Her voice shattered the quiet I had carried from my front porch. I turned my collar up against the morning breeze and continued walking. Her words were meant to shame me, but instead they freed me. I felt the chill of obligation peel away. I passed a row of maple trees turning gold in early autumn, their leaves fluttering like ticker tape. Cars passed without honking. A jogger nodded politely as she ran past. The quiet dignity of all that movement contrasted sharply with the chaos I had left behind in that house. I stopped outside a small cafe I had never visited but had seen from my kitchen window. I walked in with an upright posture, the envelope in my bag, and ordered herbal tea and oatmeal with berries. The barista asked, "Happy birthday, by the way," and I nodded and whispered, "Yes, it is." I took a seat by the window and stirred the oatmeal slowly, watching steam rise, tasting strength in the warmth. Behind me, phones pinged with social media notifications from the live stream they broadcast last night. Someone likely shared a screenshot of the cake. I let that news buzz pass over my shoulders like a breeze. I opened the menu, ran my fingers along the page, and realized I had already claimed the quiet power of the future. Outside, a woman walked her dog and smiled at me. I smiled back, though my cheeks were overwhelmed with tears held inside. I did not cry. I would not let them see that. But the silent apology on my face was, for all the nights I pretended not to notice their dismissal, now they would understand, and tomorrow that letter would force them to face it. I would not have to scream their sins. The pages of paper would do that for me. I would simply sip my tea, warm and unhurried, knowing that justice can be served with grace, and victory borne on quiet footsteps down a winding road. The first steps of that road began the moment Daphne's voice cracked behind me. I remember everything, and that was enough. The day the recordings went public, everything changed. I had delivered them to an independent investigative reporter I once helped. He believed me even when no one else did, on a simple thumb drive labeled, "Only play when truth is needed." That evening, the first clip aired on social media. Daphne's voice rang clear. She has no value, just taking up space. The next clip followed, even darker in tone. Just increase her medication, she will sleep forever. The world erupted. People recoiled in horror, collective outrage ignited under Microbe Grandma, an ironic tag that snared the grotesque underbelly of cruelty. My story broke across platforms, trending nationally in a way I never could have predicted. Talks bubbled on podcasts. News anchors called it elder justice in the digital age. Nutrition advocates, registered dietitians, and scientists began references to my work. Nutribiome was dubbed the Silver Nutrient Revolution in the headlines. A delegation from the California Nutrition Association invited me. Some were shocked it was me. But when I showed up at their annual conference in Long Beach, a meeting for clinical nutrition professionals, policy experts, and researchers, I was no longer the trembling old lady, but the keynote subject. They showcased what Nutribiome could do, a sustainable, plant-based protein source for seniors, validated by academia, created in my kitchen. Comments poured in from people I never met. Saved my grandfather, reminded me my mom is brilliant. How did I never know Grandma could be a biotech genius? Meanwhile, Daphne and Evan scrambled behind closed doors. Their carefully constructed lives unraveled in public view. Sponsors pulled out, job offers evaporated. The online community, fast and unforgiving, had marked them. I sat back, sipping chamomile at my small kitchen table, as the world, for once, witnessed that impenetrable calm carried a storm of dignity. It was not revenge with shouts, but revenge earned through truth. Their cruelty was exposed by clips, by evidence, by the quiet power of someone they tried to erase. And Nutribiome, what they mocked as old bat science, was now cited in forums on sustainable elder nutrition. I did not stand alone in a spotlight. I stood with thousands uplifted. My story was no longer a family secret. It was salvation in fermented form, shared with a world that now understood its worth. I watched the news coverage unfold while sipping mint tea in my cottage by the sea. Daphne and Evan stood under harsh studio lights on live stream, Daphne's face pale, Evan's eyes dull with regret. I saw the judge's name scroll beneath their images. Daphne had lost custody of her child, not because she was a bad person, the ruling said, but because the court deemed that someone who treats kin like space to be cleared lacked basic maternal ethics. The judge's words echoed, "A mother must nurture, not erase." But the punishment extended beyond the courtroom. Daphne's apology streamed live, trembling voice begging for forgiveness. She repeated, "I'm sorry for how I spoke, what I said." But the internet had lit a bonfire. Comments flooded in all formats, text, video reactions, even memes. One message looped on the screen. "You treated your mother like garbage. Now you're living like a criminal. Criminal family." Daphne's apology video registered more hate comments than views from genuine sympathizers. Upstairs, Evan's phone pinged relentlessly. He had been fired the moment his employer ran a background check. The toxic mix of public outrage and fading credit score sealed it. They traced a loan application submitted in the past week. He'd made the underwriting team suspicious, with changes in account activity. Within 48 hours, he was unbanked, behind on bills, and forced to apologize with a handheld sign, "Rotten Son," trending with angry emojis across platforms. I did not watch their live streams after that first broadcast. Instead, I asked my granddaughter to mail me a second cake, plain vanilla, with the icing words "Hello World" in classical handwriting, just enough to acknowledge the absurd notion that the world was still watching and I was still here. I placed the cake on my kitchen counter and sliced a piece slowly, deliberately, letting the soft crumb dissolve on my tongue. I thought of how they once dismissed my cooking as moldy scraps, and how now, even that cake felt like triumph. In the weeks that followed, local community centers invited me to speak about elder disrespect and recycled food solutions. My small cottage became a place where researchers, journalists, and elders alike stopped by, some with cameras, others with homemade muffins, but all with the same question: how do we support people like Helen Archer? Meanwhile, Daphne and Evan were careful to stay indoors. When they went out, neighbors whispered behind curtains, calling them the unchildren, a cruel but accurate epithet for people whose cruelty had broken the family they thought they owned. The real tragedy was not jail time, there was none, but living every day with the moral weight of who they had been and who they lost in the process. Days passed, and I noticed the sun setting through the kitchen window, brushing my shoulder with gold. I smiled when I walked past the cake. "Hello, world," it said. Yes, that was it. In a world that tried to erase me, I had said hello, softly, firmly, and forever. And the world, finally, was listening. I live now in a small cottage nestled near the edge of a serene lake, where mornings echo with the quiet call of ducks, and evenings hum with cicadas. The house is modest: weathered cream siding, a front porch where I drink my tea, and windows wide enough to watch the water's gentle lapping. Here I write. My keyboard clicks out daily entries into a public blog I started, Second Harvest Senior Nutrition. On that blog I share the science of Nutribiome in plain language, recipes, stories of neighbors who've regained strength, and advice on how others might ferment home scraps into protein-rich sustenance. It is not about fame. It is about giving what I can to elders who cannot afford supermarket protein powders or fancy supplements. Weeks ago, I glanced at my phone and saw an ad in the local online classifieds. House for sale, urgent, moving out of state. The picture was of Daphne's old house, and it hit me with a strange pang. She had left. No final confrontation, no tearful closure, just a hastily typed headline and new listing. The absence felt like an apology enough. I allowed myself a soft smile, turned back to my blog draft, and kept writing. Nutribiome is now available to any community center or home-based caregiver in California. No cost, no strings, no profiteering. The public license states explicitly that its formula remains open source and unpatented. Every elder deserves access to real nourishment, not empty calories. Nonprofit clinics in 3 counties have planned pilot programs. Research institutions have asked to study its effect in low-income senior populations. A tabulation quietly circulated by public health officials estimated that over 100,000 seniors have benefited from nutrition home kits containing Nutribiome packets, revived weight, improved hemoglobin, renewed energy. I have never been on a single TV show. I have not done interviews, not accepted applause, but every week, letters arrive, handwritten envelopes in meaty handwriting from women in their 80s and 90s, thanking me for making age feel alive again. Lines like, "Thank you for reminding me that being old is not over," or "I dine again because of your fermented stew." I read them on my front porch, with tea in hand and tears on my cheeks. On market circuit days, when the lake mist rises like blessing smoke, I drive to the town farmer's stand. I exchange Nutribiome for leftover banana peels and carrot tops, tiny compostable trade for tiny scraps that feed another batch. The vendors know me. They wave knowingly. I smile back and tuck their produce into a paper bag that already holds glass jars of Nutribiome fermenting on my countertop. Once, I ran into an old friend, Joan, who once called me that crazy lady who plays scientist. Joan leaned close, placed her frail hand in mine, and whispered that she had survived a winter of no appetite after her husband passed. But this summer she walked outside, tender to her grandchildren, because she added Nutribiome to her soups. No official report could capture the dignity in her eyes. Sometimes I walk down to the water's edge just before sunset. I drop a jar of used cultures into a small compost basket I bring. I watch the fire-roaring sky ripple over the lake and think about how we become more ourselves in silence, away from judgment. My cottage stands alone now, but it is a place of refuge, of subtle healing. I see the world now through the lens of stewardship, not inheritance. I touch my age-spotted hands and feel pride. They are hands that built science out of scraps, love out of ferments. I never needed their praise. I needed only to know, in the humility of each stir in my crockpot, that I saved more than data. I salvage possibility. When I close my laptop after a blog post, the lake whispers outside. We are still here, it seems to promise. And yes, that is the truth. I survived their erasure, saved lives with humblest means, and now live in quiet harmony. Peace is not the absence of conflict. It is living on your own terms, fermenting change, day by gentle day. The door tapped gently, a quiet knock I knew only one child in my life would make, knowing my cottage, knowing the rules. I opened it to find a little girl, about 7 years old, face framed by soft curls and big, curious eyes. She carried a small cloth bag, and behind her a woman who had once been a beneficiary of Nutrobiome's gift. My neighbor from the city, recovering from illness last winter. Now she stood smiling, though she did not speak. The little girl offered the bag and said shyly, "Grandma Helen, a gift for you." Inside the bag was a drawing, stick figures of 2 hands holding a spoon over a steaming bowl labeled Nutrobiome. On the back, in careful lettering, an inscription, "Thank you for making Grandma's soup taste like sunshine." I knelt and took the girl's hand. In the kitchen, I poured us both a cup of chamomile tea. I asked, "Are you afraid of being old someday?" She looked at me solemnly, shook her head, and said, "I think getting old like you is super cool." I smiled and brushed a curl off her forehead. "Getting old is not frightening," I told her. "The only thing to fear is growing old and being forgotten. But when you live with purpose, when you pour your heart into creating what nobody expects, you become unforgettable." She nodded like she understood every word. We sat at my little wooden table beside a window where sunlight painted gold patterns on the floor. I sipped my tea, she sipped hers. It felt like a promise. Age could be beauty, could be wisdom, not something to hide, but something to share. I looked around the kitchen filled with fermenting jars, stacks of blog notes, and the unopened cards that arrived each day, thank you notes from elders who regained strength, from families who rediscovered joy at the table. I realized I had built more than a recipe. I had sown hope, and for that I needed no medals, no awards, no headlines. I had nurtured renewal in people once dismissed like empty jars. That was enough. I did not expect to hear that soft rap on the screen door. I was watering my herbs, hands still damp and fragrant with mint and lavender, when I noticed a small figure framed in the glass, tiny hands pressing against the pane, hair braided and eyes full of curiosity and hope. I opened the door, and there she stood, the little girl, the daughter of the woman I once helped with Nutrobiome. The neighbor, who last winter nearly gave up after her car accident and diabetes, left her listless. That woman's daughter, now 7, offered me a smile and a hastily drawn picture in her hand. Inside, she carried a crumpled envelope, the texture of earnest crayon drawings pressed into the paper. I invited her to follow me into the kitchen. I washed my hands, then offered her a small cup of chamomile. She looked more excited than confused, and when I asked, "Do you want to sit at the table?" she nodded seriously, no hesitation. I poured the tea slowly, watching the wan steam dance between us. I asked gently, "Do you ever feel old, like other people look at you differently?" She shook her head. And then, "I think being old like you is cool." How do you respond to such honest grace? I was torn between tears and laughter. I took a small spoon and stirred her tea. "Old age isn't scary," I told her. "The only thing that's worth fearing is growing old and being forgotten. But if you live your life by making something others can't easily erase, then your age becomes your strength." She nodded seriously, as though storing that piece of wisdom somewhere deep inside her. I pointed to the fridge, where rows of Nutrobiome jars hummed quietly behind glass. She followed my finger and asked, "Is that the stuff that made my grandma well?" I nodded and said, "Yes. You know, it was invented out of scraps, out of hope, from someone they said didn't belong here." She pressed her forehead against my arm and whispered, "You belong everywhere." Years had passed, but no one treated this neighborhood like a reckoning. But here she was, with bright eyes and that, "You belong everywhere." It was what I had hoped for, but never said aloud, to matter. Later in the day, community volunteers stopped by. Some older women came to collect jars of Nutribiome for their homes. Others came to ask for advice on how to teach others to make it. A local health clinic asked for permission to hold free workshops to help families stretch grocery budgets and improve elder nutrition. All of it, I did quietly. No headlines, no fanfare. Just meals saved, spirits raised. When the little girl left, I closed the door softly. I looked outside at the garden and thought of my own fledgling, my grandson, who had videotaped the birthday live stream from years back, but now he was in university studying environmental microbiology. He had inherited more than DNA. He carried scientific curiosity, scholarly commitment, and respect for age. My legacy had traveled quietly across that chasm, from scorn to nutrition, from dismissal to dignity. Sitting back at the table, I opened my blog. I wrote a new post titled, "Remembered." I described how silence is not absence, but a canvas on which change paints itself. I cited nutrition studies and community stories. I posted pictures of a bowl of fermented soup beside a child's drawing of sunlight and spoons. I ended the post with the same line I had whispered once to the little girl. Growing old is not frightening. Being forgotten is. In the days that followed, Nutribiome packets reached more towns than ever. Volunteers stepped up. Grants trickled in for senior centers to host Nutribiome nights. The phrase, "bloodless legacy," forged of science, resistance, and math, worked its way into bullet points on aging symposiums. I never stood on a stage with a podium. I never asked for applause. But across the state, when images of older people laughing instead of sagging at tables circulated on TV, nutrient in bowl, their eyes lit, people understood. As evening fell and fireflies began to burn their tiny blue lights beyond the window, I sipped tea on my porch. The lake shimmered like reflection, casting ripples through the reeds. I thought of all that had passed, from contemptuous birthday cake to a quiet revolution. I felt no bitterness. Instead, I felt this truth. You do not need a courtroom to win. You do not need a spotlight to matter. You simply need to persist. My final legacy would not be in money to inherit or property to guard. It would be lives nourished, meals shared, science born of kindness, and a lone woman's refusal to disappear. In that quiet, I exhaled, free, remembered, beloved by strangers, and finally by the world. Elders. __life. After the reckoning, unfolded not with fanfare, but with quiet affirmation. As the leaves turned winter bare, Nutribiome quietly found its way into county-run senior programs, into the lunchboxes of food-insecure seniors, into volunteer-led fermentation nights at community centers where elders once resignedly sat in silence. I continued on the porch, the screen door behind me closing without ceremony that no one broke, and I wrote about it. I wrote about how age is often seen as a liability, until it unfolds into legacy, and how silence is not oppression, but the canvas upon which truth paints itself. There were reminders of the law's reach, slow but firm, like a tide. Within weeks, Adult Protective Services had received reports triggered by viral clips. Prosecutors quietly moved on charges of elder financial abuse. In California, elder financial exploitation, especially by family members or caretakers, can carry everything from fines up to $10,000 to prison terms of 2 to 4 years, depending on severity. Those laws, once mere text on a page to me, were now tools for justice, carved out with the same precision that social media carved reputational consequences. I did not celebrate. I only took note that systems built to protect the vulnerable had stirred not for me, but for all. Local news stations interviewed adult protective agents, citing the snippets within Section 368 of the California Penal Code, noting that misuse of authority or documents to deprive an elder of assets is a felony. That resonated with the poetic as much as it did with the legal. My story had exposed the abyss between legal protection and cultural ignoring, and the law had now moved closer. In winter's blue light, I laced up my boots and walked carefully along frozen edges of the lake. I watched a flash of reflection in the ice, my own face lined but not broken. The wind carried voices from the village. I overheard two women argue softly in French in the market, marveling that Helen Archer isn't on TV, but her name is everywhere. And then there were letters, so many letters. Some handwritten envelopes bore smears of grandchildren's crayons. One note read, "You reminded me that grandmother is not a burden." Another, "My mother ate like a queen again, thanks to the paste you shared." Hardly words for a spotlight, but they shaped lives. I gathered them and pressed them into a scrapbook, labeled "When We Were Remembered." Halfway through February, I received a call from a local member of the California Assembly, a soft-spoken woman who said, "Congresswomen want to cite your story in elder justice hearings." That call felt like a distant echo of my early experiments, visions I once conducted by candlelight in my spare room. Now legislators wanted to cite them, so that the world might see that caring science doesn't only grow in labs, it can start from compost and courage. The cottage's front gate remained unlocked, symbolic of trust, not vulnerability. Old friends visited, Joan, whose eyes shone with unshed tears, a former nurse who'd banned medical errors in her zone, calling me inspiration who does not need applause. Even Daphne's name drifted into my hearing only once, when I passed her street on errands and caught sight of a "for sale" sign. No satisfaction in seeing her distress, just affirmation I did not vanish. Their error was mine in the first place, and they paid, not with bars but with irrelevance. On a gray afternoon, a delegation from a national aging foundation knocked on my door. "We want to train professionals in rural America on Nutribiome," they said. I poured them tea, and we spoke of soil, scraps, seniors, and how innovation need not always be grand. When they left, I washed the teacups gently, the memory of hands that cared when no one wanted to stay. As spring approached, I planted seeds along the lakeshore, a mix of daisies and wild oats. I sat on the bank and traced concentric circles in the sand, thinking how small actions ripple outward until they shape communities. That was Nutribiome's magic. Humble origins, exponential reach. My heart no longer carried the ache of being silenced. It carried the quiet echo of children saying, "Grandmother like you is awesome." The world did not necessarily notice me, but that turned out to be the privilege of authenticity. I moved with simplicity, editing a blog post, sending jars to pantries, writing a note of encouragement to a volunteer in Sacramento. I wore layers in pastel blue, reflecting the lake, to remind myself of gentleness. The story I left behind would not be about a criminal's downfall or a viral feast. It would be about a grandmother who saw her worth not in the language of inheritance, but in invention. It would speak of nutrients born from neglect, fermented into hope, serving as daily patches on society's frayed edges. That was the legacy I held, and it outlasted their jokes, it outlasted the headlines, outlasted everything, except healing. For once I felt not a relic, I felt resolute. And when spring fully bloomed and the fireflies tangled with dusk, I whispered softly to the night, "I survived the silence, and the world, learning finally to remember, made me matter." ___. If this story stirred something in you, if you know anyone overlooked, dismissed, or doubted, please share it with them. Let them know that quiet strength can outlast the loudest slurs. And if you want more stories from women who were underestimated, silenced, yet still rose, subscribe to Grandma True Stories, because when a grandma speaks, the world finally listens.